that the conference is taking the place, let's say, in a epicentrum of SLAPPs in Europe. Therefore, I pass the microphone to other esteemed co-organizers. Joanna Szymańska from Article 19.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here with us. Thank you for coming. My name is Joanna Szymańska. I represent Article 19. Global Freedom of Expression organization, and on behalf of the Polish working group, on Anti-SLAPP working group, which is part of the CASE coalition and other supporting organizations, we are thrilled to welcome you today in Warsaw to discuss the issue of SLAPPs and how to counter them. With the recent publication of the EU directive, we think that the timing of our conference couldn't be more relevant. So once again, thank you all for coming and joining us.
Marzena Błaszczyk, Citizens Network Watchdog Poland. Welcome to our conference. Timing of this conference couldn't have been better, as Asia previously had said. We have published directive, we have recommendation prepared by the Council of Europe, and today we are going to talk about it, how to tackle the problem of SLAPPs in Europe, what are the main cases, what we can do as a civil society, journalists, academics, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Marzena. I'm Małgorzata Szulek. I'm one of the directors at the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, who is one of the proud co-organizers of today's event. Tomorrow, the schedule and the program of our conference is similarly packed to the one we have today. So tomorrow we are going to take a deep dive into the situation in Poland. As it was already said, Poland has been an infamous leader of the SLAPP practice in the European Union. So we are going to look into the specific case studies, the misuse of the public funds, and the bending of the legal procedures and legal provisions that were used and manipulated to initiate the numbers of proceedings that were, many of them constituted SLAPPs. The final point of tomorrow is going to be the discussion on the implementation of the so-called anti-SLAPP directive into the Polish legal system. HFHR team of experts has been working on the policy framework that is going to provide at least a platform for a further critical review and discussion how to better implement, how to perfectly implement the anti-SLAPP directive. My final sentence is a thank you to our partners and sponsors who contributed to making this event happening. And speaking of sponsors, over to you, Dominika.
Thank you very much. I'm just one of very many. Dominika Bychawska-Siniarska from Prague Civil Society Center. I am so glad that this event came into place because it's a cooperation of many NGOs that are working together as the Polish Anti-SLAPP working group. I know the program is very ambitious. We have 2 days packed with plenty of panels and esteemed guests that will provide their comments on SLAPP. I wish you a fruitful 2 days, and I hope they will be inspiring for everyone. And I think this is the time to turn to our keynote speakers. And I would like to welcome Zuzanna Rudzińska from the Ministry of Justice, Irena Guidikova, the head of Democratic Institutions and Freedoms Department of the Council of Europe, and David Kaye, professor of the University of California and former UN representative on freedom of speech. And if I could handle the floor to Zuzanna Rudzińska-Bluszcz, who is always in my eyes a wonderful human rights lawyer, working with us for years hand in hand on various issues dealing with human rights, and currently she is the Vice Minister at the Ministry of Justice. So the floor is yours, Zuzanna. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dominika, for this wonderful introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to represent the Ministry of Justice today at this very first international conference on strategic lawsuits against public participation in Poland. Minister of Justice Adam Bodnar is not here with us today. However, he will join tomorrow's afternoon discussion on details of implementation of the EU directive. So I'm really looking forward to his declarations with respect to the implementing of the directive itself. I wanted to start with my own personal story, which dates back to 2016. And it comprises of SLAPPs, Adam Bodnar, Agora, so the publisher of Gazeta Wyborcza, and believe it or not, the very title of this conference referring to David and Goliath. So in 2016, Gazeta Wyborcza, it was April, in 2016, Gazeta Wyborcza published a story about Krystyna Lemanowicz. She is an activist from Piła, the relatively small town in the western Poland, approximately 70,000 inhabitants, and she was standing against the local businessman, former politician, Polish billionaire Henryk Stokłosa in a case relating to environmental deterioration caused by Stokłosa's businesses. And Gazeta Wyborcza covered the story. Adam Bodnar, then the ombudsman, gave an interview in which he mentioned that all the legal action initiated by Henryk Stokłosa were in fact strategic lawsuits against public participation aimed at seizing of Krystyna Lemanowicz's activity. And this is when I learned what SLAPPs are. So I'm really happy that, all the actors, including Gazeta Wyborcza, Adam Bodnar, and activists are present today at this very first international conference. But 8 years have passed since then, and SLAPPs became an everyday experience for many people in Poland. Activists, human rights defenders, non-governmental organizations, independent journalists, watchdogs. They were aimed at creating a chilling effect, as we all know. They were aimed at seizing of public activity and public disagreement to many actions. And in fact, what they caused was empowerment of civil society, the civil society that right now in Poland is more united, more empowered, and more vocal than ever before. And I'm really happy about this. So there is no coming back to what was before 2015. But the discussion of the implementation of EU directive, which will take place today and tomorrow, in my opinion, should not only concentrate on transnational cases, should not only concentrate on civil measure against public participation, but also, and maybe most importantly in Poland, should refer to penal law and even administrative law, as was presented by many NGOs, including Watchdog Poland. In Poland, SLAPPs are most frequently referring to criminal law provisions that are instruments most frequently used. And it's not only the infamous and already discussed this morning by myself Article 212 of the Criminal Code, but also Article 216, which refers to insult, and Article 196 of the Polish Penal Code, which in extreme cases is used to defend public law against insulting religious feelings. The second issue I wanted to point out is that we should be aware and conscious in implementing the EU directive that in Poland it's not only about the big national cases, but also, and perhaps especially, cases against local activists, against local journalists who, in serving their local society, publicize and stigmatize the pathologies they observe in their immediate surroundings. So let's bear in mind people like Krystyna Lemanowicz and many, many others who are the local heroes and who suffered themselves detrimental effects of SLAPPs and legal harassment in different forms. And third item I wanted to underline here when opening this conference is the broader meaning of anti-SLAPP measures to be introduced in Poland, as well as measures protecting the whistleblowers. It's not only protecting the freedom of speech, and it's not only strengthening the civil society, but it's itself. But it's, from my perspective, it's also ditching the last reminiscences of Homo Sovieticus mentality, and it's building the society that is empowered and that is built by individuals who are not indifferent. And those measures should be aimed and should be implemented with this very view. Do not be indifferent, as we remember, is the 11th commandment, as was put rightly by Marian Turski. So, bearing this in mind, I wish you a very fruitful conference and discussions. Thank you very much.
Sorry, that's what always happens. Thank you very much, Zuzanna. And I would like to invite David Kaye, Professor of Law at University of California, Irvine, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression to take the floor. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joanna. And first, I do want to thank you for bringing me here to Warsaw. Thanks to all of you for joining this, and to all of the organizers for bringing this conference to fruition. It's such an important moment in the fight against SLAPPs, and I want to associate myself with everything that was just said. I think I know everybody loves to hear that, but I think it was really an important overview of the kinds of issues that people who face SLAPPs have to deal with. And I particularly want to associate myself with what Zuzanna said about the the comprehensiveness, the potential that SLAPPs are not one thing only. They are strategic litigation against public participation. That does not mean, first off, that there is a particular kind of SLAPP that we can look at and say, oh, that's exactly what a SLAPP is. It is a civil lawsuit. No, it's all of these other things that were mentioned. It can be criminal, it can be administrative, it can even be the threat of a potential lawsuit. And here's something I just want to emphasize about SLAPPs before I get into sort of the meat of what I want to talk about, although I'm a vegetarian, so I shouldn't have said meat. What I want to emphasize is the point of a SLAPP is, for the person who's bringing it, is not merely to win a lawsuit. It is a form of intimidation, and to the person who brings it, or to the organization or the government official who brings the lawsuit, the point is not to win in the courtroom. The point is to silence activists. It's to silence journalists. It's to create costs, additional costs on your normal public activity that are guaranteed or public activities that are guaranteed under human rights law. And so as we look at all of the different features over the next couple of days of anti-SLAPP legislation and directives and so forth, I think it's important to keep in mind that the mere threat of SLAPPs is something we should be not only bearing in mind, but also addressing in concrete ways through the kind of activism and the richness of civil society that we see across Poland. Okay, so with that introduction, or that kind of associating myself with what's already been said, I want to just say 2 or 3 things. I want to talk first about what SLAPPs do, just in brief. I want to say a couple of words about how this is a global problem. This isn't just a Polish problem. It isn't just a European problem. It's a global one. It's one that we see in all sorts of forms. So I want to highlight that. And then I'll conclude with where I probably should start, which is the international standards that should be, in a sense, our guiding light for this kind of topic and for addressing SLAPPs. And it's really so exciting for me to be able to talk about that kind of international standard question here in Warsaw, given that the Ministry of Justice is led by people who actually know the international standards and believe in the importance of those international standards. So, okay, so what is a SLAPP? I think I've already covered this to a certain extent. SLAPPs, however we define them, are tools to intimidate, to silence, to create costs, and to impose upon all sorts of people, activists, journalists, whistleblowers. I'm glad that you mentioned whistleblowers, the sources of whistleblowers, all sorts of intimidating kind of activities that will cause them not to engage in their exercise of fundamental rights, in particular, freedom of expression, access to information, freedom of association, and peaceful assembly. If that's what SLAPPs are designed to do, what do they actually look like? Like, how do we identify a SLAPP out in the wild? I mean, it's perfect that they're called a SLAPP. I mean, I don't know who actually came up with the initial, strategic litigation against public participation. Somebody in this room might know who actually coined it. But the SLAPP is perfect because it evokes, right? It evokes the kind of hostility and violence against somebody who has said something that you don't like. So a SLAPP is a kind of perfect coinage for that. But if you look around the world at what SLAPPs involve, I want to highlight just a few because there may be some resonance in what we see around the world in terms of what you also see in Poland. So, one, you see criminal defamation, right? So criminal defamation, this is the penal part of the problem of SLAPPs. Criminal defamation can involve a situation where an individual perceives that they have been defamed, and the penal law, the criminal code, as I think is relevant here, provides a basis for a prosecution of a person because of what they have written, because of what they've said, because of what they've organized, perhaps because of where they've organized. So criminal defamation has long been seen by international observers, by international human rights mechanisms as fundamentally inconsistent with human rights law. And it's fundamentally inconsistent because not only of the illegitimacy of using the criminal law against speech, or against speech that is, let's say, merely critical, but also because it is vastly disproportionate to any particular kind of harm. So even if you agree that there can be situations where speech can interfere with privacy, or speech can cause damage to reputation in a way that the law may lawfully recognize, criminalization is disproportionate to that offense. So we shouldn't get, and this is, I think something we see globally in the fight against criminal defamation, we shouldn't get caught up in the idea that the offense is is real, therefore it should be criminalized. The question in those circumstances is its proportionality. And in my view, criminal defamation should never be a part of the toolbox for dealing with speech. So criminal defamation is one thing. Another is, I would put under the basket of lèse-majesté, right? The kinds of rules that maybe in the ideal form, I don't mean in a good sense, but in the kind of classic form is you can't criticize the royal family, but you can't also criticize the president or ministers, lèse-majesté. It's most seen today probably in its harshest forms in Thailand, where it's also a very strongly political issue, but it allows for all sorts of penalties, including criminal ones, but also civil and administrative, actually, against those who are somehow critical of the royal family. It becomes, on the one hand, an issue of protecting national identity, but it has been converted into a way to limit discussion of issues of the highest public importance, and we see it constantly. And then finally, one other example from the global landscape is one that is actually very similar to what was mentioned at the very outset, which is the use against, say, climate change activists, environmental activists, against all sorts of activists who are perhaps critical of, let's say, private actors and private action. And again, I'll use the example, I mean, I didn't really intend for this to be a pick on Thailand Day, but Thailand has been at the forefront of this as well, because it isn't merely the fact of governments seeking to criminalize or seeking to address criticism, but it's private actors who, under the law, have the ability to bring claims, sometimes criminal complaints, against individuals for their activism. And again, we see this repeatedly around the world. Okay, so if this is a global problem, what are the standards? So I want to sort of address what those standards are, and then conclude with just a couple of points about what might be next on our agenda and on the global agenda. So from my perspective, we start with the global standards that are rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, but also the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10. But I'm going to refer to Article 19 because of Article 19 under the ICCPR and the Universal Declaration, virtually the same standard. And where I want to focus our attention is on the right that everyone enjoys. And to me, this is really important from a perspective of thinking about SLAPPs, and not only thinking about SLAPPs as tools against journalists. Article 19 guarantees everyone the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. That's virtually a quote. I usually tell my students to just tattoo it onto your arm so you remember it, but I didn't need to get the tattoo. So if you think about it, it's a right that is protecting not only one's ability to impart information, right? We tend to think of free speech as the speaker's right, but it's also the audience's right to seek and receive that information. And so in that sense, from the standard, the right that we all enjoy, the standard is a right for us. Now, many people in here are already activists or journalists, but by us, I mean participants in public space, the ordinary citizen who just wants to know enough information to make a choice when they go to vote or to participate in their local community. And so in that sense, the standard and what we should be thinking about in terms of what anti-SLAPP provisions should protect is not only sort of a right that journalists have or that activists or human rights defenders have, it's a right for everyone to access the information that they are going to impart. So if that's the standard, if that's the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, can it ever be restricted? So Article 19, paragraph 3 actually provides for some limits on that right of freedom of expression, of seeking, receiving, and imparting information. However, it is not an open-ended right to restrict that right to freedom of expression. It is limited by what we think of as a three-part test. And that means that any rule that would limit expression, and that would mean, in a sense, any rule that allows for litigation against public participation, any rule that allows for defamation, any rule that allows for lèse-majesté, has to meet these standards. It has to meet the standard of legality. That is, the rule needs to be clear enough so that we understand what is on the correct side of the red line and what is on the incorrect side. It has to be clear and precise so it doesn't provide endless discretion to the person who would use it. It has to be necessary and proportionate, right? In other words, this is why criminal defamation is so problematic, because it's disproportionate to the aim, and that aim has to be legitimate. And actually, human rights law already identifies what are legitimate aims, and those are the rights or reputations of others, national security or public order, or public health or morals. Now, I have problems with some of those legitimate ends, in part because they're so broad and governments love to use these as loopholes. But here's where I would say, and I think this is relevant not only to international mechanisms and the ICCPR and the Universal Declaration, but also to European Convention, European court litigation, or even national litigation in places like Poland or across Europe, where human rights law actually is integrated into the fabric of local law. It's critical that we, as advocates, as lawyers against SLAPPs, demand that government or individuals who are bringing claims always demonstrate that they are meeting each of those parts of the test. That is actually, I think, our essential role, is to make that demand. It's also our essential role to ensure that the law is appropriate and constricts, constrains, and in fact punishes, right, holds accountable those who use the law, who weaponize the law as litigation, as a tool to silence others. So I've gone probably just at the edge of the length I should speak here. So I want to conclude here just by saying two quick things. So the first is, it really is kind of thrilling to see what's happening in Poland today. As an outsider, as somebody who, as UN Special Rapporteur, fairly regularly was trying to highlight, based on what I was hearing from journalists and human rights defenders in Poland, and the ombudsman in Poland and his team, hearing the use of law, the weaponization of law to silence individuals, it's really exciting, but also obviously very daunting, very challenging to see the kind of steps that the government presently is trying to take to address things like SLAPPs. And so on the one hand, I want to congratulate and just encourage the government to continue on this path, something I don't think it needs much encouragement to do. And the second part is to congratulate, and to congratulate is probably too strong of a word, but to encourage us to really ensure that the new European law in this is really effective. Because European directives, European Union directives, I think we all know, tend to have a beauty on paper, but not necessarily impact on the ground. And it will only have that impact on the ground if we make that happen, actually. And so this kind of conference is perfect for giving us those kinds of tools to make it real on the ground. And I'm excited to be a part of it, and thanks for participating, and thanks for listening to me this morning. Thank you.
We will now handle the floor to Irena Guidikova, and thank you for coming. And we know and recognize, I think EU directives tend to overcome the discussions around SLAPPs, but there has been a tremendous work of the Council of Europe around SLAPP recently. So thank you for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours, Irena. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting. I feel totally privileged not only to be in this company, but also to be able to speak to you just a few days after the adoption of a European standard, which is, well, for us in my organization, the Council of Europe, equally, if not more important than the European directive. I'll come back to this in a few minutes. But first of all, to say that I am really delighted. I feel at home here because the place in the Council of Europe, my building, is also called Agora. And that's really significant in terms of the importance the Council of Europe attaches to freedom of expression, to the public debate, to the open, transparent public space where ideas are imparted in a free and unrestrained manner, but also for the engagement with civil society that this evokes. And indeed, I'm sure I don't need to explain what the Council of Europe is, but I'll still do it nevertheless, because indeed, as Dominika said, the EU still tends to dominate so much of discussion that maybe the newer generation that you are not so aware. The Council of Europe is the older and larger geographically sister of the European Union. It has 46 member states, and it's probably the most famous for the European Convention of Human Rights and the Court. But it has been working beyond the Human Rights Court and Convention on human rights, and in particular freedom of expression since its inception, using a sort of a triple pillar or triple arm system of legal standards, some of which are binding for its member states, some of which are non-binding, like recommendation, but which have a very strong political and moral drive and significance by holding states in a peer-to-peer manner accountable as to how they implement those standards. And finally, and also we have monitoring mechanisms, or even quasi-monitoring mechanisms, like the 9-year-old platform for the protection of journalism and safety of journalists. Maybe some of you have heard about it, which is a civil society-driven mechanism to alert about attacks of all kinds on journalists and hold states accountable for responding and taking measures for these individual cases, but also more systemically. And thirdly, we also have cooperation mechanisms, cooperation projects that help us bilaterally with different states facilitate the implementation of our standards. So with all these three types of mechanisms, I must say the Council of Europe is quite well equipped to follow on the commitments of its member states. And that brings me to the really big, I think, announcement or not announcement, I'm sure you're aware, but my big point today, on the 5th of April, the Committee of Ministers adopted its newest standards and its recommendation to all the member states on the measures to address strategic lawsuits against public participation. And that recommendation follows very closely in the footprints of the EU directive, but actually and I'll come back to this in my presentation during the second panel with a lot more detail, but just a few general words. First of all, it actually ticks the boxes of what already has been said today as the key elements or key concerns regarding policy and legal measures against SLAPPs. It does cover all different types of legal cases, including criminal law. And I must not hide that it was not easy. It actually took 2 years and a lot of persuasion and negotiation with member states to have them accept that particular part for administrative and legal and criminal law in particular. It also covers domestic cases, unlike the EU directive, which of course for the reasons of the EU competence is limited to trans-border cases. And that's really, really important to remind, because it will apply for most of the cases that Deputy Minister spoke about in Poland, but in many other countries. It's just enough to evoke the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was subject to only domestic cases, over 40 SLAPP cases against her that were all domestic. So that legal standard of the Council of Europe is really timely. I must say, I cannot express how grateful we are to the civil society organizations, to the Case Coalition, and all of you that have been relentlessly advocating and pressing the governments to take their responsibilities and take seriously the SLAPPs. It's not only because the SLAPP cases undermine freedom of expression. They undermine the whole set of freedoms and institutions that actually guarantee democracy. Because they weaponize the justice system and the law, they tend to undermine the integrity of justice and the trust of the public in the justice system, and that's, beyond the individual cases and freedom of expression, a really strong concern. They also undermine other rights, like the right to free trial, access to court, and also the right to freedom of assembly. Because as the other speakers said, they're not only SLAPPs against journalists, they're SLAPPs against organizations as such that are public watchdogs. So for us, the Council of Europe, we have taken this really seriously. We will continue with your help, with the help of civil society, academics, and many others, to work or hold our governments accountable. One of the ways of doing this we are actually at the moment implementing is a campaign, a Europe-wide campaign for the safety of journalists. This is not a campaign that is addressing the public with some messages. It's actually a campaign to mobilize governments themselves to create strong coalitions nationally, to look through the national legislation, the policy measures, the institutional setups, to identify the weak points and the gaps, and to take strong commitments to work on changing legislation, to introducing new guarantees, to training judges, to providing other types of guarantees to civil society, to victims of SLAPPs, and to victims of all kinds of harassment and prosecution of civil society and journalists, to ensure that the journalists are safe. Our Secretary General issues every 2 years a really important report based on the results of our monitoring work to identify the biggest challenges for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in Europe. And last year's report identified violent attacks against journalists as having been on the rise in several member states, online disinformation and hate speech as a serious concern everywhere, the use of surveillance against journalists as rising issue of concern across Europe, and the independence of public funding of public service media as also a major issue of concern. And all of these topics will be high on the agenda of the national committees for the campaign for the safety of journalists. Especially here in Poland, Deputy Minister has left, but I had a discussion already with her. Poland has not yet appointed a focal point for the campaign, has not yet set up a campaign committee. We're really hoping that this will happen very quickly, because there are other countries that are going ahead very fast and that are have already started the multi-stakeholder discussions of how to progress on the safety terrain. And we will continue working also with the case coalitions and all of you for our cooperation projects to train more judges, to explain to the public authorities the necessity to undertake a very holistic approach to SLAPPs. Again, I'll speak about it in the second panel. And we also plan, that's a very recent plan, to create a network of judges and magistrates for freedom of expression, because there is a really cruel need to specialize judges in those matters, not only SLAPPs, but the broader set of matters in that regard. And with that, thank you again for inviting, and I see you later for the second panel.
Thank you so much, Irena. It's great to have you. I guess I know that has been said multiple times, but there is no enough to say how happy we are to have you here both, and of course Zuzanna. Now I invite you to listen to Viola Von Crammon, who is member of European Parliament, and her invaluable support, contribution, and determination engagement with the civil society to pass and draft and then pass the directive has been really, really great and yeah, invaluable. Unfortunately, Viola couldn't join us today, but we will listen to her intervention through video. So thank you.
Dear Minister Bodnar, dear Professor Kaye, dear colleagues and friends, thank you for hosting today's timely and important conference on the core of media freedom defense nowadays in Europe. SLAPPs pose a serious threat to journalistic freedom across the EU and neighboring regions, including the Western Balkans and Ukraine. Journalists are the guardians of truth and democracy. They are of paramount importance to shed light on corruption, injustice, and abuses of power. Because of this, they're increasingly targeted with harassment and violence, just as in the tragic case of Jan Kuciak in Slovakia. His murder and other attacks are not only attacks on individual journalists, but also an assault on the fundamental principles of democracy and freedom of expression. SLAPP's lawsuits are designed to silence journalists and drain their resources. They are often frivolous and hinder journalists' crucial investigative work. The lack of robust legal protections leaves journalists exposed to threats, violence, and coercion. The recent events in Slovakia and Hungary remind us that democracy and media freedoms are fragile and require constant vigilance. Let us unite to ensure journalists can work without fear, and let the upcoming elections strengthen our commitment to protecting media freedoms and journalists' rights. We will continue to fight for robust anti-SLAPP legislation at the European level to protect journalists and uphold the rule of law. Thank you all for your dedication and your efforts. I wish you a very productive conference and hope to see you soon. Dear Minister Bodnar, dear Professor Kaye,
Thank you again. Thank you so much for your opening remarks. And now we will move to the first panel of our today's discussion. I would like to invite the speakers. So we will be focusing on SLAPPs in Europe, and I would like to invite Matthew Caruana Galizia, Stefan Dojcinovic, Rade Đurić, and Janos Meks to join the stage now. Thank you. And the moderator, of course, Aleksandra Gliszczyńska-Grabias.
Raz.
Thank you.
Raz, dwa, raz.